turn over the floor to William Howell, who will talk to us about education reform and public opinion.
Great.
Thanks, William.
Thanks, Jay. It's really nice to be here. When I went to graduate school, I didn't have any intention of doing anything on education. And Paul Peterson was out at Stanford for 1 year, and he said, hey, there's this thing called a voucher program. About the voucher program, he explained what a voucher was. And he said, in Cleveland, there's a new voucher program, there's an opportunity to study it. And so Jay was actually introduced me to the world of education. We spent more than a few days exploring public and private schools in the city of Cleveland and trying to make a sense of what the early experiences were of the voucher program there. It was sort of the rest is history. I'm doing this work for a little bit of time now. This project that I'd like to talk to you today about it's about public opinion, what the public thinks about a variety of education reforms. And I'm going to present you some results from the first survey that we fielded this year. We're going to go back out for each consecutive year. It's going to be an annual survey that we put out. And it started off, there are two motivations for doing the survey. The first is simply that it seems to us, this is work that I've been doing with Marty West, who's at Brown University, and with Paul at Harvard, Paul Peterson. It seems to us that the public plays a really important role in identifying what constitutes a reasonable reform to consider. They're sort of in the background for the most part. They're ill-informed about a wide variety of education reforms, but it's easy to disparage the public for lacking knowledge about education policy, and yet it seems to us they play a really prominent role, a sort of a background role, in identifying what constitutes a reasonable reform to consider that political elites obviously pay a whole lot of attention to. So we wanted to get a good sense about what the public actually thinks about a wide variety of education reforms. And most of the education surveys that are put out, the Phi Delta Kappa being the most prominent one, but ETS puts out some as well, they're just not very good from a vantage point. A number of the questions struck us as loaded. There are concerns about sampling, and we wanted to sort of go out there and give it the old college try and try to put together a set of questions that we thought would really provide an unbiased evaluation of what the public thinks about a variety of education reforms. So I think I need to turn on. How do I need to turn this on.
Yep, top left.
Top left, just hit that button. Oh, it's warming up.
Yeah.
Okay, it's going to go? Okay. So what I'm going to do two things. This talk is going to be in two parts. The first part is I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the findings that we had, and they're just meant to give you some sense about what the public actually thinks about issues involving vouchers, charter schools, and the like. And then what I'm going to do is spend the second half of the talk talking about a particular experiment that we did that was designed specifically to evaluate the impact of education research, which you all are involved in, the impact that education research can have on public attitudes towards public and private schools in particular. So, right. So, in two parts. So, here's the survey. This was conducted. It was done through Knowledge Networks. They're a firm out in California that has this panel of about 50,000 people nationwide. It's a nationally representative panel that you can field surveys to. And what's really good about them, there's two sort of good things about working through Knowledge Networks in particular. One is that because it's online, one of the things that you worry about when you conduct these telephone surveys is that people are busy they're having their dinner, they're trying to sort of get off, to get off the phone to go deal with their daily routine. And they can do it at their own pace, it's all online, and makes it much easier to run a variety of experiments and to lay out questions in great detail as need be. So that's one advantage. And the other advantage is that as telephone surveys, the response rates are just plummeting. I mean, it's really difficult to get a decent response rate doing telephone surveys. And they've got this sample that they've built up, which we've been able to take advantage of. So we're going to have 2,000 respondents in the survey. In the survey, we've got about 1,500 non-Hispanic whites. You can see the numbers, 2,000 non-Hispanic blacks, about 2,200, Hispanics. We also asked questions about who, if they, the respondent, him or herself was, or an immediate family member, worked for the public schools. We wanted to identify them as a constituency. We've got about 300 of them in the sample, and we oversampled parents. So we've got about 800 parents of school-age children in the survey, and then we adjusted all the weights so that so the results I'm going to present to you are going to be will reflect the nation as a whole. Okay, so what did they say? Right? I'm just going to give you a variety of findings that came out of the survey. But first, we asked a series of questions about No Child Left Behind, and the question is up here. Whoa. I think that did it right with the flash. Here we go. As you may know, the No Child Left Behind Act requires states to set standards in math and reading and to test students each year to determine whether the standards are being met. We're just trying to give them one sentence. Here's what that law is, in the most sort of unbiased way we could think of, giving them some of the information so they know what we were talking about. And then this year, Congress is deciding whether or not to renew the act. It's going on. It'll be going on shortly. What should they do? And what we find is that nationwide, about 57% of the sample says that you should renew it with minimal or no changes. Interesting. Then 25% renew it with major changes, and 18% say don't renew it at all. When you go across the various samples, the two groups that are most enthusiastic.
If you touch it, it advances.
This is much more high tech than I'm used to. Okay, so. Okay, I'm not going to touch it then. Okay. The two groups that are most enthusiastic are African Americans and Hispanics. And you can see just a small number across the board argue that we shouldn't renew it at all. And the group that's least enthusiastic are employees, either current or past employees, public schools, such that a quarter of them say don't renew it at all, and about 57% say it's got to be renewed with major changes or shouldn't be renewed at all. So one thought that we had is that there's something about the label, No Child Left Behind, sort of taking on negative connotations. And we wanted to see whether or not, if people were asked this question slightly differently, you'd get different responses, right? And so what we did is, 1,000 people answered this question of the 2000 survey. So another 1,000 that were randomly selected were asked the following question. It's the exact same thing. It just says federal legislation requires states to set. We're just talking about this federal legislation, right? And then what you see is that before it was 57% nationwide, I believe. Is that right? 57, 31, and 26, 57. It goes up to 71%. Say renew it with minimal or no changes, which suggests that there is something about this, just the words "No Child Left Behind," that seems to have a negative connotation. And so if you were advising, based upon this, if you're advising legislators who want to back No Child Left Behind how to talk about it, they should talk about the importance of accountability, right? And that we believe in accountability and we need to continue to sort of support the federal rules in this. So, there's a whole lot of support for it. And then same patterns go sort of across the board, except the Hispanics no longer stand out among those who are really supportive of it. These are the numbers, 71 versus 57% nationwide among non-employed. You see the jump across all these various groups when you start talking about it generically as federal legislation rather than as No Child Left Behind, in terms of their level of support. So one of the key elements of No Child Left Behind, there's a lot of talk about this, right, is that testing, and the fact that 50 states develop 50 tests and 50 sets of standards, and there's a literature that's trying to look at the extent to which different states game the system. And there's a suggestion that the whole reason why you're able to, one of the principal reasons why you're able to get the federal government so involved in this, in education in particular, is that they had lots of, they gave a lot of ground, and they were allowing states to considerable amount of flexibility so that you wouldn't trample on the importance of local control and whatnot. So we asked people what they thought about this particular testing system. In particular, we asked, under No Child Left Behind, should there be a single national standard and a single national test for all students of the United States? One standard, one test, all students. Or do you think that there should be different standards and tests in different states? This is one, my own priors where I was ready to see but 90% of the public picked the latter alternative, right? It's eminently reasonable to say we got to have different standards, different tests, different kids are different, and different communities have different priorities about what curriculum ought to look like. 3/4 of the public comes out and says they all want national standards and a single national test when you ask them this question. In some states, students in certain grades must pass an exam before they are eligible to move on to the next grade. Do you support or oppose this requirement? Just to move on, should we have a test at each grade level? And that on the basis of that test, you're allowed to move on or not. 80% support it of the public. 80%. In some states, students must pass an exam to be eligible to receive a high school diploma, right? 85% support this match. Student accountability. So one of the element of this law is that schools that are deemed in need of improvement, right, schools that fail to meet state standards, face certain consequences. And the consequences in the first 2 years are reasonably well defined, but after 5 years, the school has to be reconstituted, and it's not exactly clear what that means. And so we wanted to ask a few questions about what the public, what they would support under the sort of rubric of reconstitution. And so suppose a public school does not meet state-determined standards for 5 years in a row. Do you support or oppose the following? Replacing teachers, 2/3 support replacing teachers. 2/3 support replacing the principal. But when it comes to charter schools, the support drops way off. 29% come out and say, yeah, I support turning persistently failing schools into charter schools. Now, only 25% oppose it. Where all the action is here, this is a don't know. They don't really have an opinion about it. 46% don't know. So more on charter schools. We're going to see this. So we asked a series of questions about people's support for charter schools. Many states allow the formation of charter schools which are privately managed under a renewable performance contract that exempts them from many of the regulations of the public schools. That was our effort, again, to try to define charter schools in a short, sort of unbiased way as best we could. Do you support or oppose the formation of charter schools? Well, here only 44% of the, did I hit it? Not good. 44% strongly or somewhat support charter schools, but only 14% oppose. A plurality of them support it. But 42%, they just don't have an opinion one way or the other. I think the verdict really is out. To the extent that people have formulated opinions, by a ratio of about 3 to 1, they support charter schools. But a big chunk of the country, they just haven't made up their mind about charter schools. And there isn't a whole lot of variation when you look across these various groups. So it's among employees, 47%, right? Support charter schools, as opposed to 44% among non-employees. When you ask about funding, should they be given the same? How much funding should charter schools get? More than public schools, less than public schools, the same? As you might expect, about 2/3 of the public says we ought to give them the same. Although they're not given the same right now, which is a consequence. So here, this is an interesting thing. One of the things we tried to get a handle on is ask them some factual questions. Right? That 42%, they haven't made up their mind, suggests that they don't really know what a charter school is, so we actually quizzed them on it. And we said, based on what you've heard about charter schools, is the following statement true or false? Charter schools are free to teach, I don't know what you're going to see it. Charter schools are free to teach religions, right? There's an answer to this. They're not free to teach religion, right? And so, I'll let you see now. 63% come out and say, I don't know. And by a ratio of about 2 to 1, the people who took a guess got it wrong. Only 14%, 13% of the public knows that charter schools are not allowed to teach religion. 13%. And so, right, that's what, and so the 24% say they have an opinion and they say no. Charter schools may not charge tuition, right? The answer to that is true, but 24% said false, 60% said they didn't know, and those who got it right were 16%. And you can, here, if you go back, you'll see that the employees are more likely to get it right on both these questions, which makes sense. One of the interesting things is if you look at the subsample of people who actually know what charter schools are, they answer these questions right, their levels of support for charter schools go way up. If you look at that sample, which suggests that if what you're interested in doing is getting the public on board on these charter schools, you ought to go on a public information campaign. You ought to just start telling them what exactly charter schools are and what it is that they do. So we asked a variety of other questions. I'm not going to do the actual questions, but we asked questions about school vouchers and also about tax credits. And these are the results that you observe. These are the percent who support each of these three reforms broken out by the various groups. And what stands out is that among these various choice reforms, especially school vouchers and tax credits, African Americans and Hispanics stand out as far and away the most supportive of them. But that you still see among employees, among tax credits, 50% of employees support tax credits for sending. These are tax credits for sending for low. That our question was had to do with tax credits for low-income parents who send their children to private schools. Should they be given a tax credit for doing that? And 50% of employees said yes, and about 53% of non-employees say yes. If you look at those who oppose, they're lower, because remember we have a don't know category, which is also something which distinguishes this survey from a number of the other surveys. We allow people to say, oh, I don't have an opinion one way or the other. And here you see that employees are far and away the staunchest opponents of school vouchers in particular, and African Americans and Hispanics report the lowest levels of opposition to those particular reforms. Okay, so that gives you sort of a sense of what the public reports, and you can read all the other questions in this in the essay, which is in this volume, and you can read the actual questions that were used for the tax credit item and the school voucher item. But what I want to talk to you now about is this experiment that we did. Right, intended to assess the persuasive appeal of academic research on education. So this is a little self-conscious, right? Because you have this feeling that, we produce gobs and gobs of studies and nobody cares, right? And well, what could it have any impact? Could the research findings that we generate have any meaningful impact on people's attitudes towards public and private schools in particular? And so, right, so here I've mentioned this earlier. The public plays a really important role in determining the type of education policies that school board members and mayors and the like consider. And the content of public views is really poorly documented. This I mentioned earlier as well. If the content of the public's views is poorly understood, the foundations of their views we know close to nothing about, right? So how do people come to the views that they have about education? Any number of possibilities present themselves. So, sociotropic versus egotropic consideration. Sociotropic would be citizens walk around thinking about what would be good for the country as a whole, their communities as a whole, and it's on that basis that they formulate their opinions about what might constitute good public policy, as opposed to egotropic considerations are, well, I'm worried about my kid, right, and my school, and it's on that basis that all of my preferences follow. And remember all their alternatives, right? Concerns about race, political ideology, notions of a public school ideology, which Terry Moe talks about, this commitment that the country has to the idea of public schools, and how that might figure into people's willingness to back a variety of reforms. Notions of localism. Again, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about academic research in particular, and to see whether or not people think about what works or doesn't work. And what the facts are about public and private schools, and if they update on the basis of that research. So let me give you some facts about consumers, right? Views are poorly informed, unorganized, and volatile. This is a standard line in political science. Goes back to Phil Converse's work on the topic. This is not true, it's not just about education. This is about any number of public policy arenas, where if you ask people's attitudes, they have the views that you get are based upon very little information. There's very little relationship between the view that they express on one policy and the view that they express on another. And there's a lot of intertemporal volatility. Go back and ask them the same question 2 weeks later, and you're likely to get a different response. Well, so then for this particular experiment, much to my own chagrin, right, the public doesn't subscribe to education journals. Right? They're not reading it. Right?
Neither do I.
Yeah, all right. Right. They lack the training required to evaluate most research that is done in education. And to the extent that they learn anything about what's done, it's through the media. And so then think about what the standard story is that's written on education reform. It usually will consist of, right, a finding offered by this person from this institute with this ideological orientation, and then a quote or two of commentary. And it's sort of on that basis that citizens are given the opportunity to update or not on the basis of education research. Okay? So, first idea, I want to put the idea in your head that, look, different people might update in different ways on the basis of what it is that they actually hear. It isn't that everybody in this room, when you hear a report that school vouchers don't work, not all of you are going to update by the same amount, right, of the same magnitude. And so some things to think about when you think about the variable levels of updating that we're going to observe when people are exposed to research. One is the extent to which the findings challenge the prior views that they have on a topic. So if I come to you and I say a major study's been done and we know the sky is blue, we're not going to observe a whole lot of updating, right? So this is a pretty basic and obvious point. So too, it may be the case that the political identity of the research organization may play an important role in affecting your willingness to update in light of a news article that you read. And there's been actually a lot of work that's been done on this, not in the context of education research in particular, but in political psychology, where they show that, look, if I'm a liberal and I say, I found this thing I observed to be true, and I have private information about it, the willingness of you to believe me is going to be contingent upon whether or not our beliefs line up with one another. And so if you also are a liberal, what you'll say is, well, if I were privy to the same information that he was privy to, right, then I would probably draw the same conclusion, so I've got reason to update. But if you're a conservative, there's going to be a lot of discounting that occurs, right? So that's one part. The second part, though, is it can be a little bit tricky, right? Because it isn't just whether or not the political ideology of a member of the public and a research organization line up with one another. It's also what the content of the finding might be. So if I say, I'm a liberal, and I find that a universal voucher programs really work well, and you're a conservative, well then suddenly, right, the view that I'm taking doesn't line up naturally with my ideological priors. And so what you'll say is, there's reason to update, right? He wouldn't have drawn that conclusion were he not forced to. And so when there's some sort of schism there, right, or if a conservative were to come out and say, vouchers are a terrible thing, let me tell you why. Right? Then a liberal might say, okay, I'm going to listen to that. Listen to that conservative, when they wouldn't otherwise have done so. And then finally, the extent to which findings can confirm the prior choices, that the educational choices in particular, that people have made. So if I come out with a finding that says that the 2007 Honda Accord is the best car in the country, those of you who own 2007 Honda Accords are going to be especially likely to say right on and update accordingly and believe that finding, right? But those of you who invested considerably larger amounts of money for your BMWs, right, you're going to say, I don't believe it, right, because I got a BMW and I know how good that is, right? Okay, so we'll keep these in mind, right, because I think that they play out in the context of this experiment. So here's the experiment. There are 5 conditions. There's a baseline condition and 4 treatment conditions. People are randomly assigned to each. Okay, so we're just randomly giving a question to different people, which is nice because then we can just compare their responses and not have to worry about any background controls and trying to identify what the effect of the question wording is. The baseline condition says, a prominent research organization in Washington, D.C. recently released a study comparing test scores of similar students in private and public schools. We just say, look, there was a study, it came out, it did this thing. And we said, what about you? Do you think similar students who attend private or public schools score higher on standardized tests. Okay? So this is our baseline, because we're just recognizing some research has been done, but we're not saying anything about what the finding was or the ideological orientation of the organization that produced it. And then we just say, what do you think? Do you think that kids in private schools do better? And we said, we had these response categories. You could say private school students score higher, public school students score higher, or there's no difference. Here are the 4 treatment conditions. I'll read them for you. According to a prominent liberal research organization in Washington, D.C., students in private schools score higher than comparable students in public schools, right? So here we're given it, here we actually have a finding, and we have an ideological orientation of the research organization that's producing it. And the way we get to 4 is we rotate liberal and conservative, we flop those, and we said score higher or do not score higher. And then we just ask that, but then we come back and we ask the exact same question. We say, what do you think? Oh, I did it again. I did it. Okay. So, make sense? Okay. Here's the baseline condition. When you ask people, the percentage of people who believe that kids in private schools score higher, 3/4 of the American public thinks that kids in private schools do better. I can't tell you why that is, right? Whether or not, what they have in mind. Right, if they think there's something that private schools are actually better, they're better trained, or if it's because they think that private schools are just picking off better students or whatnot, we don't know. We don't know what the sort of foundation of that view is. But we do know that 3/4 of the public thinks that these kids are doing better than the kids in the public schools. So here's the first treatment condition, is when we tell them that private school kids are scoring higher, right? And it's a conservative research organization that's reporting the fact. Oh, I give you them both. Or if it's a liberal research organization. This is the movement from 75, okay? And basically there's none. Right? So if you're told, so if the condition that you're put into is that it says, right, a major research study came out by a conservative think tank showing that kids in private schools score higher, well then it's 74.5 plus 2.6. That's 77% of the public then in that condition said, yeah, I think kids in private schools score higher. So there's no movement. Here's what happens when you tell them that kids in public schools score just as well. There's a huge drop-off. Suddenly, there are all these people who come out and say, I think that kids in public schools do just as well. They're willing to update, right? This is the effect of the updating. And it drops to about, the 75 goes down to slightly less than 50%, and then the public comes out and says as much. So, which is the sort of asymmetric effect. If what you want to do is have a big impact on public attitudes on this particular issue, that's the finding you want to have. And it doesn't really matter if you're liberal or conservative for the country as a whole. Here's when we break out, though, the response. We talked about the alignment, though, of liberal citizens and liberal think tanks and whatnot. If you look through here, when we break out just the responses of liberals, moderates, and conservatives, right? The same lineup. Liberals, too, in the baseline condition, 75% of them come out and say, yeah, kids in private schools do better. They appear largely unaffected by research that affirms that view, but they drop way off. I mean, their levels of support are cut in half when they're told, when they're just exposed to a one-line report that says that there was a research report that came out that had this finding that suggested that public schools students score just as well as private school students. Nothing about the quality of the research, right? Nothing about, nothing, just one line is all it took to push them and cut their support in half. Moderates look a bit like conservatives, excuse me, a bit like liberals. Conservatives, though, here is, right, compared, their levels of drop-off are less than half the size of the levels of drop-off that you observe among liberals. There's a whole lot of updating going on with liberals with this finding, but not so much with conservatives. And here you actually observe some evidence that conservatives are willing to be pushed in both directions. Conservatives are open-minded, right? They're going to update in both directions because